In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to create these 4 different procedural ice cream materials. And I'm creating these 4 different materials because I'm about to release a separate tutorial on how to create this ice cream drumstick. So this video is sort of like a part 1 to that next tutorial, which I'll be releasing on how to create this ice cream. So in this tutorial, we're going to be creating this waffle cone material, and also this smooth ice cream material, and then also this chocolate sauce material, and then finally this roasted peanuts material. And then the next video that I'll be posting is going to be showing you how to create this ice cream drumstick. So when that next video is released, I'll have the link in the video description. And if you'd like to purchase these procedural materials to use in your projects or to use in the next video, then you can purchase it with the links in the description on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. And if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials, you can also check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack, which comes with all of my procedural materials pre-set up for Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. You can also check out my procedural material tutorial playlist to learn how to create more procedural materials. So real quick, I'll show you what I have set up in the 3D viewport if you want to set up the blend file the same way that I have. So I'll go to the add menu, I'll go to mesh, and I'll add a UV sphere. Then I'm going to scale the UV sphere down, and I'll type 0.16, so 0.16, and then enter, and then just press Ctrl A and apply the scale. Then I'll hit Ctrl 1 to add a subdivision surface with 1 level, and I'll shade the object smooth. And over here on the modifiers, I'll just turn the viewport and render levels both to 1. So I'm now going to move this object up and kind of move it over. Let's go to front view, and I can duplicate this, and then select both of them and duplicate it and move it down. So we have 4 spheres just to preview the materials. Then I also added the camera, and I just pointed the camera at the objects. And if you select the camera and click over here to go to the object data properties, I turn the focal length up to 80 so that the focal length is just a bit bigger. It kind of zooms everything in and makes things look a bit more flat, and I like that better. And then also if you go up here to the output properties, I set it to 1920 by 1920 with a resolution of 200, so it's a large square image. And then for the lighting, I added a few different area lights. So I added this area light right here. And for this one, I left the color as fully white. I turned the power to 100, and then I turned it to rectangle so that I can make it kind of long so it acts like a rim light. And then for this one, I did the same thing, but the power is set to 40. Then I have this other light right here. This is also an area light. The power is set to 40, and I set the shape to disk so that it is round. Also, if I go over here to the world properties, I added in this Autumn Forest 04 1K HDRI from polyhaven.com. So I'll have the link in the video description if you want to download the same HDRI. So to add in the HDRI, you can click on the yellow dot here next to color. You can choose environment texture, and then just click on the open button and open the HDRI. And then you can also click right over here to go to the render properties, and I'm going to scroll down here to the bottom. Let's go to the color management, and I'm going to set the view transform to AGX, and then set the look to high contrast to make the colors more saturated. And also here on the film tab, I turned on the transparent button so that the background is transparent so we can't see the HDRI, and it just makes it less distracting. So I'm going to go over here to the shading workspace. So I have the 3D viewport right over here, and I'll go into the rendered viewport mode. And then I have the shader editor right over here. So I'll select the object. Let's click on new to add a new material. And I'm going to be making this one up here in this corner, and this one is going to be the chocolate sauce. So this one I'll call chocolate sauce, and then I'll also be using the Node Wrangler add-on in the video. So if you don't have that enabled, you can click on edit, go to the preferences, and then over here in the add-ons tab, just search for Node Wrangler and just enable the Node Wrangler add-on. So for this material, I'm going to start by making it a very dark brown color. And if you want to use the same hex value that I'm using to get the exact same color, you can punch in the same hex value. I'm also going to turn the roughness up to 0.6 so it's a little bit more rough. Then I'm going to open up the coat to add some clear coat. So I'll turn the clear coat weight all the way up to 1, and I'll turn the clear coat roughness to like a 0.4. And then for the clear coat tint, I'm going to be using kind of this peachy color. And here's the hex value if you want to punch in the same exact color I'm using. Then I also want to add a very subtle bump just to make it look a tiny bit more realistic and add some more detail. So I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for a noise texture. Let's drop this here. And then with the noise texture selected, I'll hit Ctrl T to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. And I'm going to put the object coordinates into the vector. So it's using the object coordinates because the object coordinates will place the texture on the object more evenly. Let's Ctrl Shift and select the noise texture, preview it. And I want to change some of the settings. So I'm going to make this very detailed. So I'll turn the scale to 800. And I'll turn the detail up to 8. And I'll also turn the roughness up to like a 0.6. So let's put the factor into the normal. I'll Control Shift select the principled shader, but then you can see there's some weird shading issues. That's because I need to search for a bump node to convert it to bump data. So we'll drop it here between the noise texture and the principled. And we're going to put the factor into the height value. So now that's a bit too bumpy and I want it to be very subtle. So I'm going to turn the bump strength down to a 0.07, which is a 0.07, so it is very subtle. And that's it for the chocolate sauce material. It's a pretty simple material. So now if you want to, you can join it together into a custom node group so that you can have more customizable values. So I'm going to click and drag to box select all the nodes except the material output. I'll hit Control G to join it together into a node group. Click on the chocolate sauce name and copy the name. And we'll hit the tab key to outside the node group. And we can paste it here into the node group. And let's drag the node group out a bit so it's a little bit bigger. And I'll hit the tab key to go into the node group. And I'll hit the N key to open up the side panel. And let's double click on the BSDF here on the group sockets. And I'm going to rename this to shader because I like that better. So now we have this group input and we can plug up all the values to the group input to control them outside of the node group. So the first value that I want to control is the base color. So we'll drag the group input over here. We'll put the base color into the extra socket. And then let's also take the roughness and put that into the extra socket. Then let's drag this down here so we can add the clear coat. So I want to add the clear coat weight, also the clear coat roughness into the extra socket, and also the tint. And you could just leave it as coat weight, coat roughness, and coat tint. I like to name it clear coat. So I'm just going to rename these on the side panel. So I'll rename this to clear coat, weight, clear coat roughness, and clear coat tint. Now let's add the noise settings. So I'm going to drag this right back up here. And let's take the noise scale, put that into the extra socket. Also the detail into the extra socket, and also the roughness into the extra socket. And here on the side panel, I'll call these noise scale, noise detail, and noise roughness. And then finally, I want to control the bump strength. So we'll take the strength here, put that into the extra socket, and I can just rename this to bump strength. Let's drag the group input right back here. I'll hit the N key to close the side panel, and I can hit the tab key to go outside the node group. So we have the base color of the material, we have the roughness, the clear coat weight, we have the clear coat roughness, and then we also have the clear coat tint, and then we have some noise settings like the scale, the detail, the roughness, and then also the bump strength. Let's now do the next material. So for the next material, let's do the waffle cone. So I'll select this one here. We'll click on new to add a new material, and I'll rename this material to waffle cone. So for this material, let's go to the add menu, and I'm going to start by searching for a brick texture. Let's drop it here, and I'll Control Shift select the brick texture to preview it. And then with the brick texture selected, I'll hit Control T to add the texture coordinate mapping. And I want to use the UV coordinates because I'm going to want to UV unwrap this on the ice cream cone. So I want to place it in a specific spot. So I'm not going to use the object coordinates. I'm going to use the UV coordinates instead. Now with the default UV unwrapping of the UV sphere, the texture might be a bit stretched when you're using the UVs. So to fix this, I'm going to click over here to go to the UV editing workspace. I'm just going to zoom into the object, and again, let's go into the rendered viewport mode so I can see what this is looking like. I'll hit the A key to select all the UV island, and I'm going to scale it, and I'm going to scale it along the x-axis, just like that. So make it a bit longer like that, so they're a little bit more like a square. And you can come back and fix the UV unwrap later if the squares aren't the correct size, but I'm just going to scale them up just like that so that looks a lot better. Let's now go back here to the shading workspace. Let's change some of the settings here. So for color 1 on the brick texture, I'll make this fully black, and on color 2, I'll make that fully black as well. But then the mortar here, I'm going to make that fully white. Let's also take this offset and turn it to 0 so that it looks more like that texture for the waffles. And then here on the scale, I'll leave that at 5. And on the mortar size, I'm going to turn this to a 0.08 so it's a bit thicker. Then here on the mortar smooth, I'll turn that to a 0.6 so it's much more smooth. And then here on the brick width and row height, I'm going to turn these both to a 0.5. Now I do want to distort this brick texture just a little bit so it looks a little bit wobbly and more natural. So we'll take these mapping and texture coordinate nodes, let's drag them back, and in between here in the vector, I'm going to search for a noise texture, and we'll drop it right here between the mapping and brick. So you can see it's going to distort it. Now it's distorted way too much, so I do want to make the noise texture have less of an effect over the brick texture. First, let's just turn the scale to 3 on the noise, but I'll leave all the other settings how they are. So what I'm now going to do is search for a mix color, and we'll drop the mix color between the noise and the brick. So just stick it right here. So what we're going to do is mix between the noise, which is distorted, and the mapping, which isn't distorted. So let's take the vector of the mapping, we'll put that into color A, and then we're going to take the noise texture color, and we're going to put that into color B. So now you can see we're mixing between B, which is the noise, and A, which is the mapping. And so you can drag this factor to distort it more or less, because the factor of 0 is using the mapping, but the factor of 1 is using the noise. Now you can see the texture is moving around a lot, so if we take the mix here, we can change it to linear light, and now when I drag the factor around, you can see it's distorting the brick texture, but it's not moving it around quite so much. So I'm going to turn the factor to a 0.03, so it's just very subtle distortion, but you can now see it looks just a little bit more wobbly, so that looks a bit more natural. So this brick texture is going to be going into the displacement to displace the mesh a little bit, so that the waffle cone actually has some details which are popping out. So I'm going to box select these nodes here and drag them down here, and then what I can do is search for the displacement node. We'll drop this here. We want the color to be going into the height value of the displacement. Let's actually drag these back a little bit. So now the displacement can go into the displacement of the material output, and let's Control Shift select the principled shader. So you can see it appears to be bumpy, but it's not actually bumping out the mesh. That is because we need to open up the side panel, and we need to go here to the material tab, and we need to scroll down to the settings and go to surface. And on the bump only, we want to change it to displacement and bump, and this is telling the material that it can use the displacements. So now you can see that the waffle cone is popping out, but we need to make it much less strong. So on the scale here, let's turn it to a 0.002, a 0.002. So you can see it's pretty subtle, but it still is popping out the mesh just a little bit. And just so you can see a little bit more of the detail, if I select the sphere, let's click over here to the modifiers, and I'm going to turn up the subdivisions level to 3. So turn it up to 3 so it's just a bit more detailed. So we're now going to be adding some noise textures to create a little bit of variation in the color. So I'm going to search for a noise texture, drop this up here, and I'll hit Control T to add the texture coordinate mapping, and we'll use the object coordinates, so I'll put the object into the vector. Let's preview the noise texture, and I can change a few of the settings. So I'll turn the scale to 35, and I'll turn the detail up to 10, and then on the roughness I'll turn that up to like a 0.55, and the detail, turn that to a 10, not a 19, change that to 10. So there is our detailed noise texture. So now what I want to do is add some custom colors. So I'm going to search for a mix color, and I'll drop this right here, and the noise factor can go into the height value. So now the light and dark values of the noise texture are going to determine what part will be color A and what part will be color B. So for color A, I'm going to go with this kind of bright orangey color, kind of a light brown, and here's the hex value if you want to punch in the same hex value to use the same color. And then for color B, this is going to be more of like a light peachy color, and here's the hex value if you want to punch in the same exact color. So now the mixed result can go into the base color, and I can preview the principled shader. Let's also turn the roughness of the shader up to like a 0.7, so it's a bit more rough. And then also to make this look a little bit more soft and to make it look a little bit more like food, let's open up the subsurface. So I'm going to turn the subsurface weight to a 0.5. So now a little bit of light can go through the mesh. Now I also want to add a little bit of bump, so what we're going to do is take the noise factor and we're going to put that into the normal, but then we need to search for a bump node and put it between the noise and the principled shader, and the factor can go into the height value. So let's take the strength and we're going to turn it down to a 0.15, just a 0.15, so it's quite a bit more subtle. And then what I also want to do is select these nodes here and just drag them back a little bit so I have a bit more space here in the bump. And what I also want to do is put the brick texture into the bump as well. So I'll duplicate this bump and I will drop it here. So now the normal can go into the normal. So we now have this extra height value that we can add data into. So I'm going to take the brick texture color and we can put that into the height. So now I can drag this around to make it more strong or less strong. So we're going to be adding this bump strength into the node group so that it's a customizable value. But because the displacement is already kind of bumping out the mesh, I'm going to leave the strength at 0. However, if for some reason you don't want to use the displacement, like if you want to turn the scale down to 0, but you still want to add some bump, you could just turn the strength up. And now you can see it looks pretty similar, but we're using bump strength instead of displacement strength. But for this material, I'll keep the scale at 0.02, so it is just bumping out a tiny bit, and then this bump strength I'll keep at 0. Now the last thing that I want to do to this material is add a few areas which are a little bit more red and a bit darker to kind of make them look a bit more toasted. So what I'm going to do is go to the add menu and search for another noise texture, and I'll drop this up here, and then this mapping vector can go into the vector, and I'll Control Shift select the noise texture to preview it. And for this one, I'm actually going to leave all the settings how they are at the default because I like how those settings are. So now what I want to do is make it more contrasted. So I'm going to search for a color ramp, and we'll put the color ramp after the noise texture, and then I can drag the black tab over and drag the white tab over just to make it a bit more contrasted. So something like that. So now what I want to do is mix it into the color. So I'm going to duplicate this mix and drop it here after this mix. And this mix result is going to go into color A, and then this color ramp color, that is going to go into the factor. And let's preview the principled shader. Now what I want to do is have the darker colors of the noise texture become color B, so that some parts can be a bit toasted. So what I'm going to do is take the mix type here and change it to darken. Now what I can do is take color B, and I'm going to make this kind of more like a dark red color. And if you want to punch in the same hex value, you can punch in this hex code right here. So now you can see that some parts just look a little bit darker and a little bit toasted. Now the last thing that I want to do is control how dark the noise is. So I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for a hue saturation value and put this in between the color ramp and the mix color. And we now have this value which I can drag up and down. And so this is going to be the toasted amount. So if you want more toasted or less toasted, you can drag that value. So that's going to be it for the procedural material. So I'm now going to join it together into a custom node group. Now I do want to take the texture coordinate with the UVs, and I want to drag this over here because I don't want to put it into the node group, because most of my procedural materials are using the object coordinates, but I want my users to know that it's using the UV coordinates so that they can edit the UVs if they need to, or they can also just change it to object coordinates if they want to. So it adds more customizable controls. So what I'm going to do is box select all of these nodes except the material output and this texture coordinate. So I'll hit Control G to join it together into a node group, and if I hit the tab key outside the node group, I can now drag the texture coordinate over here and drag the material output over here. So let's now make the node group bigger so we can see it better, and we'll copy the material name and paste it here into the node group. So let's now hit the tab key to go into the node group. I'll hit the N key to open up the side panel, and I'll double click on the BSDF, and I'll just rename that to shader because I like that better. So now we have this group input, and we can plug up all the custom values to the group input. So the first value that I want to control is the size of both of these noise. Now these noise textures have separate scales, so I can't really control them at once. But this mapping has this scale value which will control both of them because they're going into the vector. So I'll put this scale from the mapping into the extra socket. Let's make this a bit bigger. I'll click on the scale, double click on it to rename it, and I'll just call it noise scale. And then if I go outside the node group, you can see it's 3 values, but I want it to be 1 value instead. So back into the node group, if we select the noise scale, I'm going to click on the type here, and I'll change it to float instead, so it is 1 value. I'll now turn the default value back to 1, and then if I go outside the node group, I need to turn the noise scale back to 1 so I can actually see the texture. So let's go back into the node group. And the next value that I want to control is the waffle scale. So I'll drag the group input right down here, and this mapping here is plugged up to all these textures. So I'll put the scale into the extra socket. Let's double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to waffle scale, and then we'll change the type to float, so it is 1 value. I'll turn the default value to 1, and then you still can't see the texture. That's because I need to hit tab and then turn the waffle scale back to 1, and then go back into the node group. Now I want to control the custom colors, so I'll drag this up here, and I'll put color A into the extra socket and color B into the extra socket. And let's rename these, so I'll just call them color 1 and color 2. Then I want to control the toasted amount, so that's controlled by this hue saturation value here, so I can drag this up and down to make it more and less toasted. So I'll put the value into the extra socket, and I'll rename this to toasted amount. Then I want to control the toasted color, so I'll put this color B here into the extra socket, and I'll rename this to toasted color. And then I want to control the roughness of the material, so I'll drag this over here. Let's take the roughness and put that into the extra socket. And then let's also control the subsurface, so the weight here, put that into the extra socket. And I'm just going to rename this to subsurface, but you could call it subsurface weight. Then I want to control some of the settings for the waffle squares, so I'll drag this right down here. And I want to control the distortion, so this linear light here is controlling the distortion for it. So I'll put the factor into the extra socket. and I'll rename this to Squares Distortion. Then I want to control the thickness of the squares. So you can see here on the brick texture, we have this mortar size. So that's going to make it bigger and smaller. So I'll put the mortar size into the extra socket, and then I'll rename this to Squares Thickness. Then I want to control the smoothness value. So if I zoom way in here, that smoothness value on the edge. So we can take the mortar smooth value, and I'll also put that into the extra socket. Let's just drag this down here. And then on this value, I'm going to rename it to Squares Smoothness. Then I want to control the bump strength. Let's drag this right up here. And this one here, that is the noise bump strength. So I'll put that into the extra socket. And this one, we can rename it to Noise Bump Strength. And then this one here, that's going to be the Waffle Bump Strength, or the squares. So I'll put the strength into the extra socket. And this one I'll call Squares Bump Strength. And then finally, I want to control the displacement strength. So we'll take the displacement scale, put that into the extra socket. And this one I'll call displacement scale. I'll drag the group input back here. I can hit the N key to close the side panel and hit the tab key to go outside the node group. And here's the final procedural material. So we have the noise scale. We also have the waffle scale. It's also using the UVs, but you could use object coordinates if you want to. And then we also have the different colors. So we have color 1 and 2. We also have the amount of toasted, and then we also have that toasted color. Then we have the roughness of the material, also the subsurface, and then the squares distortion, the thickness of the squares, the smoothness of the squares, and then we also have that noise bump strength, the squares bump strength, and then finally the displacement strength. So if you want to pop this out, you can use the displacement and kind of make it a lot thicker if you want to. So that's it for the waffle cone material. Let's now do the next material, which is the smooth ice cream. So I'm going to select this sphere here. We'll click on new, and I'll rename this to smooth ice cream. Now for this one, I'm going to make the base color kind of like this white color, but it's going to be very slightly yellow. And here's the hex value if you want to punch in the same color I'm using. But of course you could make this whatever custom color you want for the ice cream. And I'll leave the roughness at a 0.5. Let's also open up the subsurface here, and I'm going to turn the subsurface all the way to 1, so it's going to allow light to go through the mesh. So that'll make it look a bit more like food. Let's now add a little bit of subtle bump. So I'll go to the add menu and I'll search for a noise texture. And with the noise texture selected, I'll hit Ctrl T to add the texture coordinate and mapping. And I want to use the object coordinates, so we'll put the object into the vector of the mapping. So let's Ctrl Shift select the noise texture to preview it, and I can change some of the settings. So I'm going to turn the scale to 250, and then also let's turn the detail up to 9, so it's pretty detailed, and I'll turn the roughness to a 0.6. So we're now going to put the factor into the normal, and we'll just preview the principled shader. But to fix the shading issue, we're going to search for a bump node, and we need to put the bump node in between the noise and the principled. And to convert the noise texture into bump data, we want the factor to be going into the height value. And now you can see it looks really bumpy, but let's turn down the bump strength to like a 0.1, so it's quite a bit more smooth. And that is it for the procedural smooth ice cream material. Let's now join it together into a node group. So I'm going to box select all the nodes except the material output, and I'll hit Ctrl G to join it together into a node group, and I'll hit Tab to go out of the node group, and let's just make this a bit bigger and bring it over here. And I can copy the material name and add it here into the node group. Let's go into the node group, and I'll hit the N key to open up the side panel, and on the group sockets, I'll just rename this to shader. So now here on the group input, I can plug up all the custom values. So I'm going to drag the group input right over here, and let's plug the base color and also the roughness and also the subsurface weight. Put that into the extra socket. And then I want to rename this, so instead of subsurface weight, I'll just rename it to subsurface. Then I want to add the noise settings, so I'll drag this back here and I'll put the scale into the extra socket, as well as the detail and also the roughness. And then at the beginning of all the names here, I'll add the word noise. So noise, scale, noise detail, and noise roughness. And then let's put the bump strength into the extra socket, and I'm just going to rename this one to bump strength. I'll hit the N key to close the side panel. Let's drag this over here and hit Tab to go out of the node group. So here's the material. So we have like the base color. We also have the roughness, subsurface, and then we have some noise settings and the bump strength. Let's now select the last sphere, and this one is going to have the chopped roasted peanuts material. So I'll click on new to add a new material. I'll call this roasted peanuts. So let's start by adding a noise texture, drop it here, and I'll preview it, and then I'll hit Ctrl T to add texture coordinate mapping, and we'll use the object coordinates just like we have before. So let's change some of the settings. So I want to turn the scale to 10, also the detail to 10, so it's more detailed, and the roughness to like a 0.6, so it's slightly more detailed. So now what I want to do is add a color ramp because I want to make this a bit more contrasted. So I'll drop the color ramp right here. Let's drag these nodes back here so I can drag the black tab and white tab together so it's more contrasted so you can see a difference in the colors. And then I also want to create custom colors. So I'm going to search for a mix color and we'll drop this here and the color can go into the factor. And now here in color A and color B, I can create the custom colors for the roasted peanuts. So here in color A, I'm going to go with kind of this light tannish color, and you can punch in the same hex value if you want to. And then here in color B, this is going to be kind of like a reddish brown. And here's the same hex value. So now if I go back to the color ramp, I can adjust the color ramp. So if I drag these values over, you can see it'll be more and less contrasted. So I'll drag the black tab here, and then the white tab, I'll kind of drag over to about there. So these darker parts are going to be like the roasted areas. Now I also want to go to the add menu and add a hue saturation value and drop it here in between the mix and the color ramp. And I'm doing this because we now have this value which I can drag. So that's going to make the texture lighter and darker. So that's going to control the amount of toasted areas. So let's now just put the result into the base color and I can preview the principled shader. And then I'll turn this roughness to a 0.6 so it's a bit more rough. Now, when looking at reference images of these roasted chopped peanuts, there usually is some tiny little white specks, and I believe those specks might be little bits of salt or sugar. So I'm going to add that texture to add some more realism. So we'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for a Voronoi texture. We'll drop it underneath the noise, and let's take the mapping and put that into the vector. And then I'll preview the Voronoi texture, and we can change some of the settings. So I'll turn the scale to 500, and also turn the detail up to 1, just there's a tiny bit of detail. Let's now add a color ramp because I want to make this more contrasted. So drop it here and I can drag the white tab over, and you can see now if I zoom way in by dragging the white tab over, those black little specks are going to get a lot smaller. So I'll drag the white tab to about there. So now what I want to do is mix this into the color. So I'm going to take the mix color and I'll duplicate it and drop it here. And then I can take the color ramp color and I'll put that into the factor. And then I'm going to take this from mix result and put that into color B. So now let's preview the mix here, preview the mix color, and I'll zoom in. And you can see now we have all these little light colored specks. And so for the base color here of color A, I'm going to make it kind of like this light brown. And here's the hex value if you want to punch in the same color. So now that's going to add quite a bit more realism. So let's now Control Shift select the principled shader. So now what I want to do is just add some bump strengths. So I'm going to add a bump node. We'll drop it here. And I'm going to take this noise texture factor and we'll put that into the height value of the bump. And then the normal can go into the normal. So now you can see it looks really bumpy, but let's turn the strength value way down to like a 0.1. So just the surface has a very small amount of bump. Then what I'll do is duplicate the bump and drop it here. And we're going to take this color ramp color and we're going to put that into the height value. And now if I zoom in right here, turn the bump strength up, you can see we have all those little bumpy specks. Now what I'm going to do is click on the invert button so that they pop out instead of go back in. And then I'll turn the bump strength down to like a 0.2 so they're kind of subtle. But now you can kind of see there's just those little bumps there on the specks. So that is going to be it for the roasted peanuts material. Now right now it doesn't really look like roasted peanuts because it's just on the sphere. But if you watch the next tutorial, which I'll be releasing on how to create this ice cream drumstick, we'll be adding it onto these little peanut chunks and it will really look quite nice and look a lot like roasted peanuts. So let's now join this together into a node group. So I'll box select all the nodes except the material output and I'll hit Control G. Let's go out of the node group and I'll drag it over here and we can make it a bit bigger and I'll copy the material name and add it here into the node group. Let's go back into the node group and I'll open up the side panel, and here in the group socket I'll rename this to shader. So the first value that I want to add is the scale. So if I drag the group input right down here, we'll take the mapping scale, put that into the extra socket, and since the mapping is plugged up to all the textures, it'll control the size of the entire material. Let's click on the scale, and here on the type we'll change it to float so it is one value, and then I'll turn the default value back to 1, and then we'll go outside the node group and I'll turn the scale back to 1. So that'll control the size of the entire material. So we'll go back into the node group. The next value that I want to add is the peanuts color. So we'll drag the group input over here next to the color. And I'm going to take color A, which is the main base color, and put that into the extra socket. And I'll rename that to peanuts color. Then I want to control the roasted amount. So we have this hue saturation value to make it more and less roasted. So I'll put the value into the extra socket. Let's drag this down here. And I'll rename this to value to roasted amount. And then I want to control the roasted color, which is going to be this color B on the mix. So I'll put this into the extra socket and I'll rename that to roasted color. Then I want to control the noise settings. So I'll drag the group input back here and let's put the scale and the detail and the roughness into the extra sockets. And then I'll rename this, so we'll call it noise scale, noise detail, and noise roughness. Then I want to control the little chunks of salt color. So if I drag this right over here, let's take the mix from color A here. We'll put that into the extra socket and I'll rename this to salt color, or you could also rename it to specs color. So then I want to control the Voronoi settings. So I'll drag this right down here and let's take the scale and the detail and the roughness and put those into the extra socket. And then I'll just add the word salt at the starting of the name. So salt scale, salt detail, and salt roughness. Then I want to control the roughness of the material and the bump strengths. So we'll drag this right up here. Let's take the roughness, we'll put that into the extra socket, and then we'll drag this right down here to the bumps. And this first one here is going to be the peanut bump strength. So we'll put the strength into the extra socket, and I'll rename this to peanut bump strength. And then the second one here is going to be the salt chunks. So we'll put the strength into the extra socket, and this one I'll rename to salt bump strength. Let's drag the group input right over here. I'll hit the N key to close the side panel and I'll hit tab to go outside the node group. So we have the scale of the material, then we also have the color of the peanuts, the roasted amount, we also have the roasted color, and then we have some different settings for the noise, like the noise detail, roughness, and scale. Then we also have that salt color, and then we have some settings for the salt. Then we have the roughness of the materials, and then we also have the bump strengths. So I'm going to be using these 4 procedural materials in my next tutorial on how to create this ice cream drumstick. So if you'd like to watch the next tutorial, it's going to be linked in the video description when it's released. And if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials, you can check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack, which comes with all of my procedural materials pre-set up for Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. You can also check out my procedural material packs, which are packs of 10 procedural materials. And you can purchase any of my materials individually on my Gumroad store. And to learn how to create more procedural materials, you can check out my Blender Procedural Material Tutorial playlist here on YouTube. So if you want to watch the Ice Cream Drumstick tutorial, it'll be right up there on the end screen. So thanks for watching and hope to see you in the next tutorial.